Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Port Charles sank into a heavy atmosphere as the news about Monica spread from the Quartermain mansion. The dew-damp streets leading into the grounds were strewn with yellow leaves, and even the stone statue in the front garden seemed to bow before a loss too great to measure. Inside the house, the red-carpeted corridors felt endlessly long. The pendulum clock kept its steady beat, but each strike carved the silence deeper. Jason moved through the familiar rooms as if he were carrying the weight of the house on his shoulders, his steps halting automatically before family photographs. A half-finished cup of coffee leaving a warm ring on its saucer, Monica's neatly folded white coat resting on the chair in the reading room like a promise she had not yet had time to keep. He could not accept that the mother who had led the family through so many storms could depart so suddenly. The clinical bulletin, with its cold times and causes, felt utterly disproportionate to what she left behind: professional rigor, compassion, and resolve that had become the standard for the hospital and the city. Tracy clung to the fragile hope that all of this was a mistake. She stood halfway up the staircase where Monica used to pause to call everyone down for dinner, her eyes fixed on the air as if a few more minutes of steadfast waiting might summon that voice back. The breath of the mansion, the rustle of curtains, the distant sound of water poured in another room affirmed an absence that could not be filled. Long-time staff moved more softly than usual, set additional white flowers in crystal vases, and replaced candles even before dusk, each careful gesture a way of preserving the order Monica had built. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew her legacy was not in speeches. It lived in the way this house remained upright, tidy, and kind even after its heart had stopped. Back in Monica's dark-wood office, Jason paused for a long time before shelves of medical books labeled by specialty. A corner of the desk still held an open chart, the handwriting crisp and compact. On the cover of a notebook were neat lines about medication control, duty rosters, and a training plan for junior doctors. Such durable orders should have barred chaos from slipping in. Exactly there, a prickle of wrongness began to grow. The timing of the notice, the procedures that produce conclusions, small details in the medical file, even the routine sequence inside the house before bedtime, none of it aligned in the usual way. This was no longer the instinct of a grieving son, it was the reflex of someone who had lived too long on the border between light and dark, and knew when a shadow had a guiding hand. Jason shifted from shock to action as quietly as a switch being flipped. He initiated a sequence of necessary notifications to Monica's loved ones, friends, and colleagues in order of priority, while also requesting that all related documents, doodles, medication logs, and entry records be gathered for the critical window of time. To ease Tracy's burden, he kept her outside the initial cone of scrutiny and asked trusted staff to itemize every recent change in the house: the contractor who serviced the cameras, the industrial cleaning crew, food deliveries, vehicle traffic to and from the stables, and guard shift swaps. The home that had always been a haven temporarily became a diagram with points to mark. Every door, corner, and spare key might be a fragment of a larger picture. At the hospital, the news traveled faster than expected. Administration adjusted the duty roster on the spot. Portia and Terry had to coordinate clinical coverage while keeping the team calm, because when a pillar falls, all eyes turn to process. The pharmacy was reminded to re-inventory, retain control samples for sensitive lots, and stamp exact and end-out times with signatures and titles. Britt submitted a proposal to return at the exact moment patient load was swelling. If approved, it would help fill a genuine clinical gap but would also mean tighter scrutiny of clinical security and system access. Every click and every card swipe now counted as data that had to be preserved. Back at the mansion, Jason requested a copy of the preliminary medical report and cross-checked it against the house's real-world timeline: heating system on-off logs, the patio door sensor, the corridor camera on the second floor where Monica usually passed before turning in, and the kitchen's activity journal. The dry numbers began to show scratches, a blurred frame at the time change, a door sensor recording an opening without matching footage, a shift handover note missing the second signature required by policy, a dosage line handwritten in a way that did not match system data. Any single detail could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern of discrete interference. Jason widened the radius. The list of subcontractors over the past 3 weeks was sorted by level of access to sensitive areas. Unfamiliar names were cross-checked with phone numbers, license plates, and time on site. The camera maintenance team was asked to reconcile their work with the system logs. An archive backup image was slated for restoration to determine whether the blur came from a lens fault or a signal tamper. The hospital's pharmacy team was asked to hold control samples of all lots Monica had used recently to analyze rare interactions the initial report had not fully ruled out. Meanwhile, Tracy still gripped the best possible outcome. She arranged the main parlor for visits, reset the family altar, and lined up photographs in chronological order to create a visual river of Monica's life. The neat collar from her early days, the hospital's Medal of Merit, the rare shot from a fundraising gala. The meticulousness was not only commemorative, it calmed those who came to pay respects. Jason respected that cadence, keeping investigative activity out of shared living spaces, yet all critical memos still reached him via a separate channel, and mixed with any other schedule. New data kept surfacing. A camera maintenance ticket was found to be handwritten differently from previous tickets despite listing the same contractor. The numerals for the installation time were darker than the rest, as if written over. A food delivery arrived later than usual, citing traffic, but the license plate recorded on the grounds did not match the guest log. A medication sheet showed a line edited in blue ink, while policy allowed only black. These were all minor ripples that a careless eye would miss, but to anyone schooled in Monica's discipline, they were wrong notes in a house like this. Jason refused to jump to conclusions. He built a timeline spanning 3 days before the incident to 2 days after, plotting entries and exits, clinical activity, deliveries, maintenance calls, and every system state change. Each point became a dot, each dot linked to a note, and from that mesh a deliberate route emerged, accessed through a camera blind spot, coinciding with a non-routine delivery, paired with a minor tweak in pharmacy procedure capable of altering a biological response in ways hard to detect. This was not a spontaneous act, it was the work of someone who understood how the system ran or had a guide on the inside. Monica's rigor inadvertently became the yardstick. Jason used the very rules she had championed to test everything again, double count, cross-confirm, refuse undocumented exceptions. When every verification doorway produced a mismatch in the same slice of time, he knew this loss lay beyond the borders of fate. He quietly changed the internal label, no longer calling it a natural passing, but a suspected deliberate intervention. From that moment, private grief became a public mandate of conscience, and calm precision the only weapon to keep Monica's memory from being distorted. The house kept its order. Flowers were refreshed each morning, table linens were ironed flat, picture frames were dusted. Beneath the tranquil surface, a new lattice of controls took shape: stricter guest log, temporary lock code changes, zone staff access, and more frequent backups for every recording device. These layers were not for show. They were declarations that Monica's legacy would be guarded through concrete action. The city might be submerged in mourning, but here, even a glass set perfectly in place was part of a promise. Beyond the gates, Port Charles continued to move. The hospital redistributed shifts, departments added cross-checks, closed-door meetings tightened pharmaceutical security. From Steinmauer to satellite clinics, Monica's name came up with quiet solemnity. Everyone carried a version of her: colleague, friend, mother, and every version demanded the same thing: the truth. Jason knew that better than anyone, so he kept going, from dark hallway to records room, from camera logs to furnace notes, from that stray blue ink correction to the bold numerals on the maintenance ticket. Each detail was set into its proper place on the map of inference, and once the lines were long enough, they would point to a name. By now, the infillable space had changed color. It was no longer only a dull ache, it had become a space into which justice could step. The Quartermain mansion stood in the afternoon light, sunbeams through the windows laying a thin aureole across Monica's photograph. It was not a sign from beyond, merely physics, but in this context it read like a reminder: keep the order, return every piece to where it belongs, and call out what is wrong. Jason gently closed his notebook, looked around the room that had been the command center of a model life, and moved on to the next step. In Port Charles, grief is truly eased only when the truth is told completely, and in this house, the truth must be so exact that no one can argue it away. Jason refused to wait for answers to drift toward him. He convened a small, trusted cadpeople who understood discretion as well as procedure and assigned each a precise slice of the work. One pair reconstructed the medical timeline minute by minute from the last 72 hours, pulling every page addendum and electronic entry tied to Monica's care. Another pair audited the house infrastructure, door and window sensors, heating cycles, motion detectors, and the private camera grid that covered the main corridors. A third reviewed procurement and maintenance paperwork for the mansion and for Monica's recent clinical routines, looking for anomalies in contractors, deliveries, and authorizations. Working in parallel, they brought him fragments that felt innocuous alone but, under the discipline of arrangement, began to cohere into a shape with edges. The medical timeline exposed the first set of ripples. The timestamp on a nursing addendum sat for minutes ahead of the bedside monitor's synchronized clock, an offset small enough to dismiss. Except that pharmacy dispensing logs referenced the monitor's time. A rare dose entry appeared on a medication reconciliation sheet, noted as a one-time administration for comfort, yet its presence had no corollary in the physician's written plan. In isolation, either could be chalked up to clerical fatigue and a stressful window. In sequence, they described a corridor where a deviation could be concealed as compassion. Jason asked for lot numbers, vial counts, and waste documentation for every medication touched. He wanted chain of custody from locked drawer to vein and back to the cooler for returns. Where a signature appeared, he traced it to the badge swipe. Where a badge swipe existed, he tied it to a camera frame or a witness lock. The more tightly he cinched the loop, the clearer the slack around those 4 minutes became. Across the house systems, an entirely different texture of anomaly emerged. A camera that had performed flawlessly for months produced a blur during a single 9-minute block precise interval when the patio door sensor recorded an open followed by an immediate close. The maintenance ticket for that camera, filed the day before, named a subcontractor the family had never used. The handwriting on their field was darker than the rest of the form, as if written over a previous digit. Utility logs showed a brief dip in line voltage to the east wing at nearly the same time as the camera's blur, too shallow to register as an outage but sufficient to cause a reboot. Individually, the items could be written off as coincidence. Together, they formed a contour, a blind spot manufactured in advance, reinforced by paperwork, covered by a nuisance fluctuation. The household traffic map brought the actors closer to the stage. Jason's team compiled 3 weeks of deliveries, repairs, and visitor check-ins, then layered them against the mansion's internal sensor network and driveway camera captures. 2 deliveries deviated from their normal schedule, a late-night food drop with a license plate transposed in the guest log, and a linen service swap that parked briefly on the service drive rather than the usual bay. A groundskeeping contractor arrived with a different crew on a day it did not normally work the property, then left 9 minutes after the patio sensors recorded open-close. The badge authorization list for the week contained a temporary code added to the staff keypad and deleted 2 days later, with no justification in the notes margin. The pattern that emerged was not of a single intruder but of a corridor made by several ordinary actions, each angled a few degrees off the usual line, to meet at the same latitude and hour. Inside the hospital, the pharmacy audit delivered the most clinical proof that something had been engineered. The one-time administration used a compound known to carry rare but significant hemodynamic effects when stacked with a sedative in the same metabolic pathway. The sedative did not appear by name on any chart, yet its metabolites would not be expected in a post-event sample unless exposure occurred in the previous several hours. Jason requested independent mass spectrometry on retained control samples from the lot numbers in use and a recheck of the automated dispensing cabinet's bin histories. The cabinet's drawer showed an open-close record during the 4-minute discrepancy window, followed by a manual override that the machine stamped as door ajar. That phrase could hide in 1,000 routine shifts. Here, it read like a thumbprint pressed lightly into wet paint. He refused to let the investigation cannibalize the household's grief. While he mapped timelines and reconciled logs, he also created space for Tracy to choreograph the rituals of parting quiet rooms for visitors, framed photographs arranged chronologically. The dining table laid as Monica would have insisted, precise, unpretentious, welcoming. Staff schedules remained stable. No one was interrogated in common areas. No rumors were allowed to outrun facts. Yet he raised the invisible guardrails 1 notch. Guest books were moved closer to the entry. Lock codes were rotated. Sensitive zones were zoned off with the gentleness of good manners and the firmness of purpose. When he contacted Monica's colleagues, former patients, and confidants. He did so in an order that honored their connection to her and prepared them for the possibility that the narrative might shift from tragedy to crime. To keep the picture honest, Jason organized the information by layers rather than by sources. The first layer was time, a single ledger that accepted entries only when two independent clocks matched. The second was access, an overlay of doors, drawers, keypads, and digital credentials that traced who could touch what and when. The third was intent, a more delicate stratum composed of deviations from routine late substitutions, altered routes, exceptional approval should could signify planning rather than happenstance. When an item survived all three layers, a mismatch aligned with an access event that coincided with an exception, he elevated it to a convergent marker. The rare dose entry, the cabinet override, the camera blur, the patio open-close, the maintenance ticket, the voltage dip, and the ghost temporary code all earned that status. Laid onto a single canvas, they formed a corridor so narrow and straight that it would have been invisible had he not drawn its edges inch by inch. The shape of the perpetrator grew in negative space. This was someone comfortable with clinical processes or coached by someone who was, they knew how to hide an extra step under a compassionate notation. How to exploit the lag between manual charting and machine time. How to pick a sedative metabolite window that muddied causation. They either had physical ingress or enough influence to compel it. The subcontractor veneer, the mislogged plate, the temporary code, the conveniently timed voltage skim. They favored small levers that moved large outcomes, micro adjustments that left no single screaming flaw, only a cadence of small rung notes that resolved into a melody when played together. That preference told Jason as much as a signature might have. Even as the net tightened, he spoke no conclusions into the rooms that were meant for condolence and remembrance. The house needed order, the hospital needed steadiness, and the people who loved Monica needed a narrative that would not break under revision. He wrote his findings as cleanly as Monica would have, each assertion balanced onto facts, each inference labeled as such, each unknown held in suspension rather than forced into shape. He accepted that the truth might demand a broader circle law, oversight, regulatory bodies, but he would meet them with a record already scrubbed of ambiguity. Precision, not fury, would carry Monica across the threshold from loss to justice. Meanwhile, he let the community grieve. He watched Tracy choose flowers that Monica would have approved, watched staff iron table linens until they lay like quiet water, watched friends arrive with casseroles and leave with steadier spines. He ensured that each condolence call going out carried grace, and each call coming in was logged with the same care he applied to access records. When people asked how they could help, he directed them toward the living things Monica had loved, the scholarship fund, the resident mentorship program, the patient library. He preserved her standards in motion as he reconstructed her final hours in graphite and timestamps. By the end of the second day, the anomalies no longer floated. They nested, one inside the other, the maintenance ticket enabling the camera blur, the blur sheltering the door sensor's blip, the blip coinciding with the cabinet's override, the override framing the medication deviation, the deviation aligning with the 4-minute timestamp drift. Each piece could have been innocent somewhere else. Together they were an outline with only one plausible intent. Jason closed his notebook, not in relief but in resolve. He had not spoken the word aloud, but the inquiry now bore the weight of a homicide. And even as he kept the house gentle and the hospital steady, he began the quiet work of turning a corridor of small wrongs into a single, incontrovertible truth. Poor Charles had weathered schemes before, boardroom betrayals, forged documents, backroom arrangements that unraveled under their own arrogance, but this time the cruelty hid in dosage windows, timestamp drift, and the quiet plausibility of a compassionate notation. That was why even the most hardened shoulders in town stayed a fraction tighter, why the hospital elevator rides felt longer, why charts were initialed with a care that bordered on reverence. Monica was not only a physician of uncommon skill, she had been the city's North Star for what rigor and mercy look like when joined without compromise. The truth about her death could not be argued into existence by outrage, nor willed into shape by grief. It had to be assembled to her standard, layered, verified, and resistant to heat or spin. Jason understood this with a clarity that left no room for theatrics. He was not hunting a face to punish. He was building a conclusion so clean that, once the final name was set on the page, justice would enter of its own accord, without speech, without spectacle. because the evidence would already be arranged in the only order that made sense. The city moved, but on a revised tempo. In conference rooms where dry erase smell always mingled with stale coffee, new control items appeared on whiteboards in a precise hand, dual clock reconciliation for all critical timestamps, mandatory cross-signature on what-time medication orders, randomized integrity checks on automated dispensing cabinets, quarterly vendor attestation for subcontractor access, camera uptime audits with backup verification against line voltage logs. These were not the kind of measures meant for press releases. They were friction introduced on purpose, tiny speed bumps in workflows that forced the hands involved to leave clearer prints. At the pharmacy window, techs paused to voice their readbacks out loud for one another, then documented the checks as if someone would come looking later, which someone now would. In the resident bullpen, a threadbare binder labeled Exception Protocols was stripped down and rebuilt from the spine outward, each page newly paginated, each edge tab relabeled. Each decision tree marked with the threshold at which a second attending must be pulled from sleep or meeting, no excuses. At the mansion, the administrative ledger shed its veneer of routine and took on the gravity of a living archive. The list of subcontractors was scrubbed to bare wood. Long-standing vendors were validated not by familiarity but by documentation. Temporary codes were outlawed in favor of site-specific tokens that expired to the minute. Camera placements were reviewed against historical blind spots with a cartographer's eye. The staff did these things without fuss, because order had always been a form of love in this house. Fresh flowers still arrived each morning, linen still lay flat as a lake at rest, and the family portraits still caught afternoon sun in soft squares. Yet beneath the polish was a lattice of accountability, strung tighter, tuned higher, and humming in quiet defense of what Monica had built. Beyond institutional walls, the community processed the loss in chores and choices. Former patients wrote notes that named recoveries by their calendar dates and listed small instructions Monica had given: hydrate as a discipline, rest without permission. Tell the truth to your chart and to your child in the same breath as their gratitude. Colleagues remembered how she had corrected them without humiliation, insisting that precision was a form of respect owed not only to science but to the person in the bed. Neighbors sent casseroles and then stayed to wash dishes, leaving kitchens cleaner than they found them because that, too, felt like speaking her language. Quietly, a scholarship fund that had once been funded by annual dinners began to swell with private gifts. The resident mentorship roster gained more volunteer preceptors than slots to assign. The memory of Monica, handled like an heirloom, did not calcify into ritual. It translated into practice. Jason worked while all this unfolded, refusing to let the investigation consume the rituals of grief or the rituals of care. He nested his files by layers so that anyone who followed could trace the method, a master timeline that collapsed all clocks to a common reference, an access map that showed, door by door and drawer by drawer, who could have touched which object at which second, a variance ledger that caught every deviation from basal delivery out of schedule, note out of in color, contractor out of pattern, and tallied where 3 or more variances converged in the same 10-minute window. He labeled inference as inference and kept his verbs honest. He welcomed the possibility of third-party audit before it was required, knowing that a record built for scrutiny would need no translation when scrutiny arrived. No red arrows marked villains, no highlighter screamed. Instead, there were footnotes, cross-references, and a calm insistence on the integrity of sequence. As the days folded into one another, the reform seeded by grief began to root. Nurse managers instituted shadow rounds in which a second set of eyes verified time-critical events against machine logs before charts were closed. Facilities scheduled rolling resilience tests for the electrical feed that powered recording equipment, not to cause failure but to measure how failure would present if induced. Supply chain added a clause to vendor contracts requiring for-cause audits within 24 hours of any flagged incident, with breach penalties stiff enough to discourage complacency. None of these changes could rewrite what had happened, but together they narrowed the avenues by which such a thing could be made to happen again. Inside private rooms and public ones, Monica's story organized other conversations. In medical ethics seminars, attendings translated her habits into policy frameworks, that compassion is not an undocumented dose, that convenience is not a contingency plan, that the burden of proof rests on the deviation, not on the baseline. In leadership meetings, administrators took a scalpel to complacency, acknowledging where familiarity had been mistaken for control. In living rooms at the end of long workdays, people spoke of her without dramatics, as a standard both reachable and demanding. A way to move through tasks so that no one has to ask later whether the right thing was done. And in a room lit by a single desk lamp, Jason kept at the puzzle's edge. There was a point beyond which one more cross-check would not add resolution but only delay. He knew he was approaching it. He sharpened the last lines, checked the last references, and weighed the last alternative explanations until only one remained with enough gravity to hold the others in orbit. He did not think of revenge, because revenge was imprecise. He thought of a door with the right name on it and a handle that would turn because the key arrangement of facts, the geometry of access, the cadence of variance effort without force. When that threshold was crossed, his family's pain would not evaporate, but it would stop being shapeless. It would become the kind of proof that carries a person through the long corridor from harm to remedy without collapsing under doubt. So the city turned on, altered and alert. The whiteboards filled and were erased and filled again. The mansion's vendor list shrank and then stabilized under tighter criteria. In countless kitchens, quiet stories about Monica were told the way recipes are told, with measurements and a feel for the moment when something is done. And in that small pool of lamplight, Jason fitted the last shard where it belonged, not to finish a narrative but to begin a prosecution that would need no flourish. When he closed the folder, it was not as a coda but as an opening to the part of the work Monica had valued most, the part where the truth, once painstakingly assembled, simply does its job.